And to start this it's really a conversation and us to have together with a particular moment of history. And I think to locate where we are today in our newsrooms, I think we have to locate ourselves in a particular moment of history. We just started 6 years ago with November 9th, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and what transpired after that was we know the history was the great triumphal American era, and things were good. Overnight, reading Karl Marx was bad, and wearing Reebok was good. We watched Jordan and less much Stalin. So that was where we came from. Here in East Africa, but in particular Kenya, which is my context of this conversation, uh, the liberal democratic dispensation that America ushered in was actually met with a lot of joy, because at the time Kenya was facing a economic recession. Then we were going through structural adjustment programs, which we just signed from the 1980s. Something similar to what's happening today. Of course, a different name. We're calling it austerity, debt-driven austerity, but the conditions are really much the same. Cutting back of health, education, etc. Again, just like now, also Kenya was under an authoritarian regime, under the president Arap Moi. So it's almost similar, like just like now, because his political disciple, if you may, is president, right? So there's a kind of similarity with where we're facing today in terms of just the political and economic measures. But interestingly, what was useful about then and now was the young population that were coming out of particularly university. We had something called JAB. JAB was the government-sponsored. Students would be given quite a bit of money to be a university student. So you had quite a bit of time and freedom to be a leftist, a radical, etc. So all that was cut because of now the graduate programs. But then the question then was, what do we do with the graduates who are coming out of university? Of course, Kenyan political players and public policy pundits didn't have a solution for that. So what came was that a black market was formed, so that the civil society as we know it, coming out from the 90s, rather cementing itself in the 90s, was largely donor driven, was largely Western driven, was largely pushing Western liberal democratic ideals and values. However, because of the context of where society was, it was a welcome change. The then ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Kenya, Smith Hempstone, championing this kind of things. If you look at the roles for that moment, we see even the church, key players like Reverend Timothy Njoya saying Kenya is now ripe for democracy. So all the local forces and international forces came together. So it was in a sense, it was a useful marriage, if you may. So at that time, it was cool to be a civil society actor. It was cool to be a anti-corruption crusader, because you had Western allies. It was cool to push liberal democratic values because you had Western allies, and it was cool to do this kind of stuff, so that because you had people supporting you, because you were aligned to what in that sense the American dream was pushing world over. So we went that way, and a couple of things went that way, and then you can proceed to the next slides. Well, we went that way, and for a moment there, we're all told that it's the end of history, right? We're all it's the end of history, and as Fukuyama, it's the end of history, and the only thing that was left to do was now to have technical fixes to your political problems. So we didn't need to philosophize our moment. We didn't need to have a kind of political consciousness for kind of daily struggles. All we needed this was a model. So it was the election's not working. It's probably the problem with either there's some technical fixes. So it's in Kenya, maybe it was the ballots are not coming. Where do we get the final tally? Is this the polling station, or is it the the tallying center, the National Tallying Center. So we go to court. And then now the Macau ruling is it's a tallying the polling station is a final verdict. So that became our dance. That became our dance. Even to the extent that even when we pushed out Moi, that was our dance. Our dance was we were doing technical fixes. So authoritarian is bad, democracy is good. We removed Moi. Then of course President Kibaki comes into power in 2002, and we continue this kind of liberal democratic agenda, and it was great, particularly for this generation, the young guys who now came of age agitating for this. It was useful. It was fun. Civil society was a thriving intellectual space with all these kind of ideas, backed, as I said, by Western donor funds, and the liberal democratic model was great, a good time to be alive. So much so that even in 2002, when President Kibaki came into power, it was again a moment of euphoria for country. And this generation again, set up things. The late Binyavanga Wainaina, who is part and parcel of this generation, wrote a fascinating book, how to write about Africa. Yes. And it was a verve. It was cool. Things were good. And we loved it. Kwani was set up, and it was a literary space, was expanding, was burgeoning, and we were enjoying what was happening in this particular time, isn't it? And we even contested, as you guys are, you said, we contested the idea that Africa is not a country, and this publication is called by that, and it was a time for that, the 2000s, and it was time for that, so much that even in 2007 with the post-election violence, that it just seemed like a blip. It was a blip in our journey, our liberal democratic journey. It was a blip in this dark cloud in a rainy paradise. Of course, 2010, because of 2007, we cemented these gains, and we promulgated our constitution in August 27, 2010, and things kept moving. Things kept moving. However, I know, just like history doesn't move in a straight line, but it rhymes. An accident happened in 2013. ICC suspects, former President Uhuru Kenyatta and current President William Ruto teamed up, and they pushed an impressive campaign to win power. So this was almost like it was a chink towards our liberal democratic gain. So they clinched power, and we found ourselves in a hole, So what happened after this was about 2014, 2015, members of this generation, because this generation felt that all the things we had sacrificed our 20s and now 30s for, there were increasing democratic recessions. Civil society in 2014, 2015 had now been named evil society. We're seeing blowbacks in implementing the 2010 Constitution, particularly in health reforms, devolution. We're seeing increasing counter blowbacks, but also a kind of counter reform agenda. So members of this generation sat together, particularly the progressives of this generation, late night coffees, teas, debates. And in 2016, the Elephant was formed. And it was formed as a platform for dialogue, to speaking truth to power, to reimagine citizen society. And it was like exciting times, because now it was how you needed a space. You needed a space. There was by then there was a shrinking civic space. Dennis Galava, Gado, and many people in our many columnists and editorialists within Kenyan newsrooms were being let go. I don't want to say fired, because it's fired. When you say fired, it terms a kind of HR problem. There was no HR problem. They were being let go. A lot of the calls were coming from state operatives, the editorials are too far or their cartoons are too far, so they were let go. Interestingly, an anecdote: many of them were being let go by being given a scholarship to the UK. So they go scholarship when you come back, you don't have a job. So it was an interesting way of letting go of people, is that you promote them. The Peter Principle says they promote the level of incompetence by this way, giving them scholarships to the UK. So that's how it went. It was exciting. Early days, it was exciting because not just the elephant in many ways spurred a kind of environment within Kenya's public sphere to rethink our society. And in early days, things were exciting. We wrote about ourselves to ourselves. In the lines of Steve Biko, we wrote what we wanted, and I think that was exciting. And there was an exciting time in Kenya's public sphere in that particular time. But again, he doesn't move in a straight line. So with COVID and with COVID and stuff, but interestingly, because of the conversation happening in the public sphere, not just inspired by platforms like the Elephant, by Africa as a Country, Debunk Media, Africa Uncensored, Baraza Media, and all other kind of media outlets at the time, but also the conversation in the public sphere, and many narratives that were held very strongly, pushed by the state, were dispelled, but also were dispelled, but they were falsified by that kind of stuff. So by the time we're getting to 2020, COVID is happening. Our political elite realized that the prevalent narratives in which they were to capture power and manipulate the voters were not able to hold forth. Of course, by then Kenya was already 2018. We already signed our first IMF discretionary loan. So we're already beginning our journey of austerity, the debt austerity that we are in. So the cost of living is high. The useful narratives that are held were not able to hold together. And as Nanjala Nyabora writes in her book, Digital Democracy and Politics, the new forms of political socialization were happening digitally. They were being rendered digitally to different kind of spaces, either through digital platforms, but also generally the internet. So Twitter, of course, now X, Facebook, and also the dark web, WhatsApp, etc. So it's almost like a reconstruction of our public sphere was happening in real time. Current President William Ruto, understanding this, marshaled a unique kind of campaign, realizing that the old narratives of the political elites to hold on to power, parochial tribalism, we're not appealing, particularly for a younger demographic who increasingly are being socialized. The political socialization is coming from digital platforms. Marshaled a kind of campaign, dubbed Hustlers versus Dynasties. So it was on form it was a class campaign. On substance, it was hollow. But at the time, campaigns, unfortunately, PR branding schemes in most parts of the world, we don't have ideological conversations about them. So, but that kind of appeal attracted largely the youth, who showed up in droves and voted for him. Of course, the margin was thin, but it showed a shift towards Kenya's politics. Again, backed because of the success of the kind of work that platforms like the Elephant and that had done in the last since 2016. So it was a hard moment, if you may, for this generation, particularly the progressives, who thought, what was the liberal democratic experiment for if after 35 years of advocating for it, pushing for it, it leads us to this moment where it was actually a member of YK92. YK92 was a political vehicle of President Moi to organize the youth against these liberal democratic reforms that actually were now coming into many parts of Africa, and in this particular case, Kenya. So it was a kind of a moment of disillusionment, really, for many in the country. So again, Nyabola wrote a piece for the Times and said, if you hear an airy silence coming from Kenya, it's because we're all in disbelief of what has just happened, and at Kenya this particular time is a kakistocracy, is what she defined Kenya as. So from 2022 there was a kind of stalemate to where we are, isn't it? And last year something happened, something fantastic happened, is that the younger generation, interestingly, they're actually the children of the generation that actually began this journey, took to the streets, the Gen Z revolution, and began agitating for what was started by their parents not be complete. So which was actually the push of constitutionalism, real reforms, particularly police reforms, economic reforms, the full implementation of the constitution, sovereignty, which is the conversation around debt sovereignty, around looking into conversation around Chinese debt, but also IMF and World Bank, and also Western powers. So that has been the conversation pushed by this generation. So to the extent that now we find ourselves here. So we find ourselves here today in a kind of revolutionary moment kind of thing, that we don't know where we are going, in the sense of we don't know what's going to come out of this, but we know we know where we're not going. So I mean, as you rightly put, it's actually to quote Gramsci, he says the old world is dying and the new world is not yet born. Now is the age of the monsters. So we find ourselves in a kind of the age of the monsters, where we know where we are from, we don't know what's coming, but we're in the age of the monsters. So just to tie that, just two ideas before I conclude, is that one, Kenya in many ways is in a revolutionary kind of moment. We have been here. We have a couple of pathways out of here, but we're not aggressively saying how do we move kind of this stuff. Even the status quo, they were pushing for kind of self-styled kind of Russian oligarchy kind of pathway, where you're trying to create a kind of Bolshevik kind of revolution, but then it was captured by kind of Stalin kind of stuff, and that what was happening for the last couple of years. But then we have the youth, in a sense, that the Gen Zs are coming to age in a kind of very kind of French Revolution kind of esque-ness, where they're really kind of they're really trying to push a kind of new social contract with the Kenyan state. But then also on the other side we have the older guard, who are kind of seeing what's happening, and they're trying to kind of stall the revolution, a kind of German revolution, kind of 1848 kind of way, where you capture the revolution and you bring reforms with your kind of pace. So this is a kind of scenarios that we are finding ourselves in for the youth. But for our newsrooms, because our newsrooms we are finding ourselves in a kind of hard place with what's happening, not just in Kenya but also globally. We're finding ourselves in a very hard place where there's a kind of shrinking contracted civic space, journalists being intimidated, abductions, but not just by journalists but by other people. Of course, just the technological shifts happening in the newsroom, but also donor interests moving towards other spaces. So lack of Western allies. So the Gen Zs are also coming to they're doing this thing they're doing without support from Western allies, as it was for their parents. So this is a kind of space that they're finding themselves. So I just want to conclude with one last point. And I've been reflecting about the Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. There's that biblical tale, that he sends his disciples out and tells them go cast out demons, and they come back and they tell him, we tried and nothing happened. And then he tells them some of this kind of stuff goes with through prayer and fasting. And I think I was thinking about this tale when I was thinking about the age of the monsters, because in a kind of sense, theologically, monsters are demons. They take territories, and so I was just thinking about how then do we think about ourselves within these kind of spaces of thinking about our freedom. And I think we have to start thinking about our newsrooms with a kind of with this holding these two things in tension about prayer and fasting. And I'm not advocating for having newsrooms that do deliverance and prayer corners. But I think when we think about this notion of prayer is a notion of deep meditation. I think as editors, as journalists, sometimes the noise we have to start creating pockets of silence where we're able to meditate on what actually we need to do. We can chase everything, but the age of monsters, we have to really focus on what's the light, and really think about that stuff as a meditative kind of practice, and to think about how do we even equip ourselves as journalists in these kind of times to think of ourselves as newsrooms as spaces of prayer. But then also lastly, to think about our newsrooms as spaces of fasting. And I'm not advocating for guys not to have meals. I think food is important for journalists, very important. But I think it's also that thing to rid ourselves from unnecessary baggage. I think we find ourselves in Kenya, but also I think in Africa and the world, where we haven't been here before. How do we negotiate, but also rethink how we are looking at a multipolarity, shifting hegemons, wars, famines, droughts, counter revolutions and counter reforms, all at the same time, trying to move the needle forward towards a better, more just society. And I think we have to really start thinking of ourselves of how then do we fast away of the gunk that we have carried to be sojourners in a better world that I think this moment is calling us to create. So friends, with those very few remarks, I just want to leave us with a quote by Teju Cole, the great American poet and writer. He said that we have to learn how to sit in the dark together. So I think one of the things we have to very, very clearly and carefully is to really learn in these particularly grim times as a society is to learn how to sit in the dark together. Thanks, guys.
Amen.
The first question. Wow. So I've noticed the amount of capital investment. At the same time, as austerity has come and loans, there's been foreign companies investing, obviously, in the infrastructure.
Right.
And so my question to you is, what is the opportunity what is the demand? So the protest movement, what is the demand from foreign capital? And so, and I'm thinking, it made me think of Zohan Mandani, who a lot of us have, because following contributed to the site in the past, is running for mayor of New York, and his proposal is to extract tax from the foreign capital that has taken over New York, or multinational capital, and to, it's time for you to pay your dues and destroy this austerity regime that that was intensified during COVID. He's doing well. We don't know if he's going to win, but he is surprisingly in the top 2 for candidates. And I'm wondering, what is the ask of the Gen Z generation, and is it possible to hear demand for capital to pay their dues back to society?
That's a good question. I think this is a question that no one is asking, particularly here, because one, we're calling Gen Zs our children, or our children, and they are badly behaved children, kids who are raised badly, and so this is the kind of stuff that's happening. But if we listen very carefully to what they are saying, is that Gen Zs are asking for a new social contract with the state. A new social contract with the state. So how I was thinking about it coming here is that what happened is that older generations, their parents in particular, because their parents' generation who actually agitated for the constitution, pushed for a legal contract. I mean, we assumed it was also social contract, but it's a legal contract where it was almost like a stopgap measure to check our elites. Our elites had gone too far and we said we need a stopgap measure. That was the constitution of Kenya. So what they're asking for is much more philosophical, where they are pushing for a social contract with the state, and they're saying that this is we don't just want this thing written in a constitution. We want it lived out. So and then so we pushed for that. So we have yet to push for certain reforms that have been pushed back in for instance, police reforms. We had a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission that is gathering dust in Parliament. Nothing has been done to it. With the Critical Commission, with all these commissions that reports were done, but there wasn't any intentional and political will to implement those reports. So it's a really social contract. But two is that even as they are agitating for a social contract, the question has been and is if we push the state, how come the state is still operating the same kind of behavior, particularly around capital etc. And I think what they are pushing for is actually the reform of those institutions. We said we are pushing for the reform of the state, but we didn't realize that the state also has tentacles in the media, has tentacles in civil society, has tentacles in the private sector. So what Gen Zs are pushing for is a complete overhaul of those other, the third estate, fourth estate, etc., so that they can be totally reformed and the church as well, begin to look like what they want to see. So, and I think that's a cornerstone of their reform agenda, because even when talking about foreign capital,
so the state has the power to do it, but the state doesn't have the will.
Precisely, but more importantly, also other actors. There was an assumption that other actors now will also imbibe the spirit of the constitution, and I think what Gen Zs are now saying with a full social contract is that they want civil society should be reformed, they want the church to be reformed, they want the media to be reformed. So to fully now get the gains of what the constitution was now promising to every Kenyan.
I have a question. Because in Algeria we had this similar movement in 2019. It's been 6 years, but we're still not, the old world is behind us. We're still not in the new world as well. We're still with the monsters. But one of the things that we noticed as journalists was initially when the movement broke out, social media was a big part of, conveying real sentiment, showing real images on the street. But the state, it's a resilient thing, and they found ways to muddy those waters, whether it's, troll accounts, bot accounts, whether it's other journalists that decided to toe the state line and their way of seeing things. What's been the experience sort of like in Kenya? Do you guys deal with these kinds of things? How do you combat it? That's sort of my question.
Yeah, so recently there was a prominent politician. She said something bizarre to the effect that we have to pray the spirit of social media out of Kenya. So she was using very theological terms, very theological, very Christian deliverance kind of terms for the spirit. There's a dark spirit on social media that is corrupting the youth. So I think there's a couple of things that social media has gone through different variations. So the state is increasingly trying to figure out how to muzzle social media. But it's hard because the internet is connected to our financial systems. So disconnecting the two is proving difficult. So I think particularly after the Gen Z revolt last year, June 25th, last year, is that what the state has done has gone into state abductions, intimidation, and kind of co-opting some of the faces within the revolution. Yeah, precisely. So you offered money, you offered opportunities, you offered opportunities, money, and it's the usual tactics the state trying to to contain. And two, also one thing very interesting in Kenya is because Kenya is a very religious society, is by the language in which we talk about the protests, particularly by the state. So the language that the state uses to talk about the protests is kind of, these are juveniles, delinquents who are misguided, who need to be morally guided into being well, into being well kind of, good human beings kind of thing. So the language is used aggressively to try and muzzle, but also to shift blame.
Has it been effective with some demographics?
So it hasn't been effective because at the core, as I said, and I think this is something that I think is unique to Kenya, is that this is the first generation that is philosophically oriented. So when you're in your philosophy, unless you answer the philosophical question, I mean, we'll be here till we'll be here. So, and I think because of the archaic but also parochial nature of the state, but also political elites, unable to be philosophical in any way, they think that throwing bottles of water and jobs will figure this thing out. It's impossible. So your philosophical question, which is Gen Zs are pushing for a new social contract, that's a philosophical paradigm they're pushing for. At the same time, which is also a pain point for us, is that we're in a recession. So if we're not in a recession, you could co-opt not a few, but a part of it, with opportunities. But since we are both one in a philosophical moment, but also in a recession, it's impossible. I mean, you have to answer both those questions at the same time. In fact, if you answer a philosophical question, you're able to answer the economic question. But where we are unable, our elites are they're unwilling, but also they're unable to answer those questions. So what has happened is that we have been in this kind of cul-de-sac of, that's why 2 days from today, we're going back to the streets because they've been unable to answer these questions.
Job Kenya, I think if I got that right, this kind of scholarship program of the past that funded the student radicals of the 80s and 90s. And so that made me think about like student unionism and like student organizations. I mean, so, and of course then one thinks about unionism in general and the sort of associational groups that aren't necessarily dependent on external funding. And of course, the story across a lot of the like third wave democracies in Africa has been that those kind of groups have tended to be absorbed into the political settlement.
Right.
But have there been remnants of the previous radicalism that are in conversation with the Gen Z thing, or do they, so there are two ifs there: if they're remnants, and then if they're in conversation, and if not, then what happened to that? To the kind of radicals of the old associational groups.
So I mean, they're always remnants. I think, and I think Dr. Amwe would written and talked about this well better than I have, is that from 1965, there's been progressively over the years to stifle, to kill, or to co-opt the student movements and the unions. The unions, unfortunately, in Kenya were already killed by the late 80s. They already been killed or co-opted. The complete muzzling of a student union in 2018, there was a law that was passed in Kenya, which completely has now killed our student politics, just because of the legal infrastructure, the arrangements of that law means that student politics has now been rendered almost obsolete in Kenya, because of now there's lack of space in kind of projecting and also agitating for political reform. Well, tied to this is Tandike Mkandariwe, the late political economist. When he talks about SAPs, strategic adjustment programs, he uses very unique language. He calls it Africa's Great Depression. And what happened was that there was a muzzling of, our universities were completely destroyed. Health sector, education, unions, productive work. So you don't have what do you need labor unions for when you don't have labor? You don't have labor when increasingly our elite's primary way of expanding the economy is through the service sector, which is legitimately, or through procurement, which is either buying and selling, or in this case, importing and exporting. So, you're running a real logistic Kenya is becoming a logistics company. So labor has shrunk significantly, and what remains of it is completely muzzled and stifled. So we are finding ourselves in a space within another wave of austerity, which is really hard, because it's now completely killing any kind of remnant within the universities. Within our health sector is completely destroyed. This is the last year in which Kenya is going to have primary education. So basically, you have a functionless state that its only usefulness is the monopoly of violence. So we're finding ourselves. So Gen Zs are finding themselves where it's really pushing for a full, as I say, a social contract where everything of the past has been destroyed, where they're agitating for a new kind of reality that is hard for not just for the city, but for every other generation, because they're pushing for a new kind of reality that currently the state is not willing and unable to steer that new kind of imagination.
So, okay, if I quickly follow up, I mean, so yeah, no, that's a really interesting, helpful response. But so there's an extent to which the story is kind of urban, right? So what about the countryside at the moment? Like, is the Gen Z phenomenon also playing out in the countryside? How are the dynamics different? And okay, one variable that I think about in the context of Nigeria, I wonder how it factors here, is that so we're also undergoing what feels like a new structural adjustment. The currency has just been re-liberalized and the major subsidies removed. One of the justifications, as it was in the 80s, is that agricultural produce, because of inflation, will be more expensive, and so farmers will be the ones to reap the benefits. It's kind of rebalancing the political economy in favor of farmers. So it didn't really happen in the 80s, but it looks like there's some of that happening now. So I guess I wonder, maybe two things. One, what's the story in terms of the push for reform or the new social contract in the countryside? Are you getting some of that? And then I guess we had this very interesting conversation with smallholder farmer yesterday that really opened my mind to dynamics in the countryside. So to what extent is there really a rural population with a political voice in Kenya? This kind of sounds like, from that conversation, that that there's a sort of possibility of an extinction of smallholder farmers, or at least there's a desire to kind of. So so maybe it's just for the second question first, in a way, that is there possibility of political voice in the countryside? And if there is, then what are they saying at the moment? What are people outside of the city saying in this moment of transition?
That's a good question. So let's look at some statistics. It was useful to answer that question. So last year, the Gen Z protest, out of 47 counties, 37 took part actively. So it was not just an urban thing. It was 37 counties out of that. However, which is interesting, which is I think important to note, is that a lot of the narratives are coming from urban areas, which is, but also that statistic is also important, is that Kenya currently is 32% urbanized. By 2050 will be 50%. So we're increasingly, our urban rate is 4 to 6% per year. So we're increasingly urbanizing aggressively. So I think that's another dynamic that also we have to start thinking, where it's not people coming to the capital cities of Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, and Eldoret, but we're increasingly seeing, largely because of devolution, that other secondary towns and cities becoming urbanized. So to my mind, what's happening is that we are it's what happened in the UK, with the industrial revolution, but without industry. So so people moving from the agrarian societies into towns and cities, right? So that same thing is happening. One agrarian societies within Kenya being transformed very aggressively into towns. So, and a large of it is actually the service sector is what's driving this kind of production. So, professionals that you see in these kind of places moving into towns, and professionals, and a lot of it transport logistics. I said, Kenya has become really a supply chain kind of economy, moving things in and out. So you have that. That said, is that it's again, it's an argument. So it's not my original argument, but it's an argument by Tandike Mkandariwe, that though those are Africa Great Depression is happening there, one of the things about SAPS and this is SAPS is that it kills the state. The state still has colonial baggage with it. So with that kind of it's a very tense kind of argument, is that it provides for people who are not within the state to flourish a bit. Right. Yeah, and then we saw that guys who are in rural areas, like today, for instance, tea farmers are happy in Kenya. Right. Milk farmers are happy in Kenya. Yeah, but the conversation is that they're not many. Right. Yeah, not many. And then also what happens is that to what extent do they thrive? They may thrive because they sell their primary produce as milk only. But if they now move high up the value chain, they now have to organize, because now they can't make yogurt because there's someone who controls a yogurt market, and etc. So it's it's a mixed bag, and I think there's that. It's useful to hold all these arguments and debates to see what kind of process we are going towards.
So, my question is kind of bringing it back to the media conversation. Like you've mentioned how, the Gen Z is really focused on the philosophical social contract and really kind of gleaning answers as to what they want out of the state. And, in my assumption is that a place like Elephant is there to kind of help facilitate those conversations. But like you and I had a side conversation talking about how, right now media is at the behest of capital, right? So the places to have these conversations, like in Africa as a country, like an Elephant, like so many of these places are suffering at the, need of how to prop up our industry so we can continue to facilitate this transition while also remaining solvent. Are there conversations like that happening in Elephant Magazine about how to continue to facilitate the dialogue with Gen Z while also confronting the limitations of the current media financial ecosystem? And what are you guys thinking about, in that current conversation?
Interesting. So, yeah, so I mean, that's closer home and more painful and personal as a journalist. So I think, yes, there are those conversations, because now how does the media rethink itself out of this kind of context? But I think more broadly is that I think it's not an elephant or Africa as a country. I think it's a media conversation. For Philip Ochieng, one of the veteran journalists in Kenya, wrote a book called "I Accuse the Press" in the 80s. And in it he says that African journalists have to ask themselves two consistent questions: the technical know-how of journalism, so it's writing well, shooting videos well, editing well, the technical know-why of journalism, which is the, as you rightly said, the philosophical social context of what's happening. So I think it really is a media question, because I said earlier, which is, and it's with all of humility, is that the social contract that Gen Zs are pushing is for reform, not just of the state, which is clear what needs to be reformed, because there's been agitation for that. There's been agitation for the constitution. We have commissions, we have stuff like that, but it's a reform of the whole edifice of what is a state, including the media. So even I, as a media practitioner, we have to go through a reform process, because sometimes is that we are agitating for certain things, but for instance, the media we're not upholding the 2/3 gender rule, for instance, or so we are throwing stones, where we are poking the specks in your brother's eye, yet you have logs in your eye. So I think it's an internal philosophical conversation that everyone needs to have within their sectors, because the social contract wasn't just like the independence social contract. It was the conversation the independence generation asked, pushing now to from Mau Mau and stuff, was that the social contract they were asking for was Africanization. And that's what they pushed for. They wanted Africanization. They wanted black faces in every, and that was a conversation from 52, the state of the emergency, all the way to the 60s now, and of course now power had been taken. But that was a conversation. Civil society, black faces, media, black faces. Now these are pushing for a new social contract, and I think why we are missing it is because we are used to, everybody is used to saying, if there's problem on the streets, let's look at government. And I mean government, like, the executive and stuff like that. And of course, they more often than not in Africa, they are the bigger problem. But this kind of times, like we're living in, like the independence generation, they're not looking at the government. The conversation is looking at the whole state. So even civil society has certain, you also have state logics that actually, if we go and ask people like this is, someone will tell you, working here and government is the same thing, because you have logic to those spaces that have mirrored the logics of the state that people are asking to reform.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Related to that question, I'm curious, with the disappearance of Western donor funding, have you or any other kind of alternative media newsrooms considered other funding models, and what were they or are they exactly? And then just in terms of the Gen Z revolt, I'm curious, who are the journalists or, I don't know, influencers perhaps who covered that particular revolution and are emerging as perhaps thought leaders or philosophers to capture that moment?
That's a good question. So I think the conversation about the models is such a pain point to the whole sector.
Sorry.
No, honestly, it's such a pain point because it's touching on livelihoods, it's touching on careers. So I think to be very honest, I think it's one of those. There was a story I read years ago. The late Christian apologist Ravi Zacharias, he was preaching in Russia in USSR post the collapse of Berlin Wall, and he preached, and the general who came and asked him and told him, I hear what you're talking about with this Christianity and all these things, but you need to understand, he was in his 70s, for the last 50 years, I've believed in communism. If I accept this idea, what do I do with my history? So I think that's where the media finds itself. If we accept change, what do you do with our history? So I think, and I find that's a very painful internal conversation that we are unable to. What do we do with our history if we are supposed to now reconfigure our whole media model around what news is, how do we report, what do we consider analysis in the age of AI? Yeah, so I think that's the kind of space where there are models of community journalism. There are those little experiments that some are working, some are still early days. But I think as I said, it's a conversation for the media sector within itself to have a philosophical conversation for with a technical know-why and know-how of what we need to do. And then now we say this is now what we are as new journalists for 21st century AI, authoritarian, the world is dying kind of work.
So there's like an identity crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then for journalists, I think a couple of outlets. I think the Easily Voice is one of the outlets that has emerged, that is doing very phenomenal work. Easily Voice. doing Easily Voice, very very phenomenal work, particularly the last couple of months, covering the Gen Zs. Of course, at the Elephant, we've covered the Gen Zs as well. I think, yeah, in terms of journalists, I don't think I can name like a particular journalist who's saying, because it wasn't a moment for a person, it was a moment for a collective. But what we are seeing emerging is new kinds of thought leadership. I attended an event, a cultural event, and I was taken aback by the level of 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 consciousness with Gen Zs, in particularly how they articulating themselves to the world, particularly around liberal democratic values. And it's cutting across a whole generation, not just urban folk, but even rural folk. How I think it's part of it is I think there was an article in the New York Times a couple of years ago, the sociology of the smartphone, how the smartphone has just fundamentally changed just how the political socialization. So you're talking to them and you realize how much aware, but the kind of new consciousness emerging, particularly their rights. Their rights. What was before the purview of university professors and a few activists is their daily lived experience. They have things like drunken lectures. So you find Gen Zs in a place in Nairobi and they are partying and drinking, but they're having philosophical conversations. They're taking walks to the park, and when they go to the park, they're having meditations on René Descartes, and these are not university professors. These are just your usual graduates having that. So I think it's a kind of new phenomena that is, in my view, we have never had a generation like this in Kenya, at least in my view and also in my experience, where they're flirting more with ideas as part of their daily lived experience. That's why I was liking them to a kind of French Revolution kind of stuff for the Jacobins, like you guys believe in this stuff,
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up question? So would you say this kind of consciousness is limited, or is it limited to graduates, or is it just kind of pervasive? Because I'm thinking about what happened in South Africa quite literally just a decade ago with Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. Like that felt like it was limited to a very particular kind of Black South African university student. And I don't necessarily think it infiltrated like the public sphere, or at least like spread to young students who were elsewhere, or young people who were elsewhere. But to me, this sounds pretty pervasive. This, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think it's very pervasive. Very true. One, but also to qualify it, is that it's not anti-capitalist. Yeah, sure. So I think I have to very, very qualify. It's not anti. So for me, when I look at it, it's almost as if they're absorbing the zeitgeist of the world, where it's also multipolar. Right. So the crux of it is that it's liberal, and it's diverse, but it's not anti-capitalist. There are elements of anti-capitalism for sure there, but broadly speaking, the consciousness, I wouldn't term it as anti-capitalist, like it's a new broad left, or like the roads must fall. But it's almost a rejection of a kind of parochialism. It's almost, when I look at it, it's almost, if I was to give it a kind of majoritarian kind of perspective, I would say it's almost like it's a rejection of a particular kind of capitalism. But not. So it's almost like it's a push towards a kind of democratic capitalism. I know that's an oxymoron, but
that's why I asked about these Oracle building across the street.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's like tangible all of a sudden. This like massive multinational company, and so not only are you seeing your rights in your pocket, you're seeing the engine of the thing that's putting it there. So how do you, that $1 million building that just went up, how can that change my kitchen table? I don't know.
So you absolutely agree. So I don't think it's not an anti-capitalist kind of movement, but it's a kind of, it's a redistribution kind of movement.
I want
I want to be part of this thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a
That's what it is.
it's a redistribution kind of movement. So, but that said, of course, there are very progressive elements within it, extremely progressive elements within it. So as I say, it's a new kind of social contract within the state. And I mean, absolutely. I mean, as a journalist, I cover it and analyze it. As a philosopher, I mean, it concerns me to the extent that this kind of stuff just leads to one of the three things: corruption, adoption, and or muzzling it all together. So
Have you read the Vincent Bevins book about?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Though this concerns me on one hand, but also on the other hand, what is also interesting is that because we have never been here in Kenya, but also in the world, it also is interesting because the late Samir Amin, the Marxist, talks about the Great Awakening. So within these contradictions, there's also a Great Awakening as well. So it's a complete mixed bag that we can't. I think the more I think about it, and I think is we have to locate these new paradigms, new kind of philosophical lenses, because I think we are also with multipolarity. Also, to my mind, means the death of the usual left-right kind of politics. So I think we have to start thinking about a new kind of imagination, a new kind of ideological planes. How then do we speak about ideological politics in a multipolar world? Because we have China, we have Iran, we have Russia, and all of them are contesting global power, and other little players, Brazil, etc. I think with this kind of contestation is that the usual USSR, East-West kind of conversations, I don't think are useful. And I think it was this is not my original ideas. I think it was Lewis Gordon actually who actually says this. The philosopher Lewis Gordon says that our challenge today is that we are still, our ideological frames for seeing the world, we're using the past or near recent history events for articulating the world, but to actually begin to actually have new frames to see, as you talk about capital, but all of this capital is also there's Western capital, but there's a lot of Chinese capital here at the same time. So I think we're in that kind of age where thinking about new lenses of analyzing who we are, also analyzing the world would be useful. Rather than just the usual Marxist, kind of right-wing, left-wing frames of seeing the world.
Anything you want to say that we should know and that we haven't asked you about?
How hope you guys are going on the streets. If you're around, I'll be in the streets from tomorrow. Yeah, we'll be supporting the Gen Z. Yeah, Kesha, there's a rerun. There's a rerun. And then on Wednesday we're in the streets. I think we are. So one thing though, African countries also for the left hand, I think particularly for guys covering Africa, is that I think this is my own personal reflections, is that we are underplaying the role of religion in how it's shaping governance but political debates. African, I think the global, African parts of the non-Western world are increasingly, if you look at the statistics, both not just the Abrahamic faiths of Islam, Christianity, and not Judaism, particularly to Islam and Judaism, Islam and Christianity are increasing, and there's a re-rendering of the world, but also a kind of interpretation of the world that is coming organically from these kind of spaces. So I think for us, really starting to think about even within our newsrooms, how religion is shaping. I think religion, in my view, is and will become the most potent force shaping our governance questions for the foreseeable future.
And churches by votes.
Sorry?
Churches by votes.
Yes, and we're seeing that, and I think we have to start thinking about that much more intentionally and aggressively in terms of like, hey, how then do we what's coming out of that stuff? Because if we are to go into history, is that Europe finds itself as a superpower by interpreting Judeo-Christian texts, Judeo-Christian texts, and coming and what we call their European secularism was a rejection not of the subtext but a rejection of the primary identity. But the subtext was still the European understanding of Judeo-Christian texts. So I think even as the world is resetting, I think my argument is that the most potent governance questions moving forward are going to be theological reflection. Mm.
Yeah, I guess it happened here in the 80s. I mean, here in Africa, with the birth of Pentecostalism.
Yeah.
There's a version of that.
Even in Brazil, right?
Even in Brazil, but this one is interesting. But no, with the Brazil in the 80s and 90s, the Nigerian scholar Benazo Badari writes, New Pentecostalism. That's a different thing because they, the Pentecostal preacher replaced the professor as the meaning maker. Because you're seeing now with ACPs, the universities can't employ. So all of a sudden now the Pentecostal preacher becomes the kind of this existential manager. Who is now actually telling people how to live. This to my mind, this is different from then because then the Pentecostalism, the wave in Brazil, in Africa, was still supported. It was still it was the other side of liberal civil society. Because civil society, as I said earlier, there are two coins it had. The liberal society, which came from the NGOs and etc., with democratic, but the other side of it was the conservative, which was the Pentecostal, which we really talk about was the Pentecostal churches. This is completely different. What I'm talking about is almost a kind of, this is the age of the monsters, is a kind of how do you kind of reread this kind of text within a multipolar world.
It's not irrelevant to the global north either. I mean, I guess Europe less so, but I don't know if you count the United States fully as the old West, it is a colony itself, and Pentecostalism is driving much of the political conversation.
Having senators, go on interviews and say, defend Zionism,
Yeah.
And the way it's been able to adapt to online trends too.
Yeah.
Scary.
Yeah, the dance challenges, like the
influence. It's just so.
The Mormonism in America is very aggressive.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.